The afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the sprawling Central Park. Joggers darted past strollers, families enjoyed their picnics, and kids squealed in delight on the playground. Amid this vibrant scene, Sarah Ellington strolled along the paved path, her designer handbag swinging lightly at her side. She was joined by her longtime friend, Bethany Carter, a woman who prided herself on her unfiltered opinions. As the two women walked, Bethany gestured towards a man sitting beneath a large oak tree, his wiry frame hunched over, and beside him sat a battered hat with a few coins scattered inside. His clothes were tattered, his shoes so worn they barely clung to his feet. Bethany leaned closer to Sarah and muttered under her breath, "They're always here, aren't they? Ruining the park for the rest of us." Sarah glanced at the man, her brow furrowing slightly. "You'd think they'd find something better to do. I mean, we all work hard to keep this city running. What do they do?" The man, Joe, sat motionless, his gaze fixed on the ground. He had long grown used to the whispers, the glances, and the judgment. Yet, even with his bowed head, there was a quiet dignity about him, an air of resilience that defied the image others imposed upon him. Bethany huffed. "I mean, if they really wanted to, they could get a job. Plenty of places are hiring." She adjusted her sunglasses and scoffed. "But no, it's easier to just sit here and expect handouts." Sarah nodded in agreement, though her words came out softer, almost hesitant. "Yes, it's unfortunate. But what can you do? Some people just don't want to help themselves." Joe didn't react, but Walter Jenkins, a nearby police officer, caught the exchange. From his patrol bike, he observed the two women as they passed. Walter had seen Joe many times during his rounds. He knew bits and pieces of the man's story, how he ended up here, what he'd endured. Walter couldn't intervene now, but he noted Sarah and Bethany's judgmental remarks with quiet disapproval. As Sarah and Bethany continued walking, the conversation shifted to lighter topics. A recent charity gala, Sarah's daughter Lily's upcoming school play, and a new boutique that had opened downtown. Yet, as much as Sarah tried to move on, a faint unease lingered. She glanced back once, briefly at Joe's slumped figure. The sight of him didn't stir pity, but rather a vague discomfort she couldn't quite name. Bethany's voice jolted her back. "Sarah, are you even listening?" Sarah forced a smile. "Of course. What were you saying about the boutique?" Bethany rolled her eyes. "I was saying, it's about time we got a place with decent taste. Honestly, this city's becoming so diluted. First the people, and now the stores. What's next?" Sarah gave a polite chuckle, but her thoughts wandered. The park felt different today, brighter, yet strangely heavier. She couldn't pinpoint why, but she brushed the feeling aside. Joe adjusted the strap of his tattered backpack and sighed deeply. The coins in his hat glinted in the sunlight, a measly sum that wouldn't cover more than a cheap sandwich. He knew what they thought of him, the whispers, the stares, the quiet derision. Lazy, they'd say. A burden to society. But they didn't know. They didn't know about the nights he spent trying to sleep on a cold bench, the times he skipped meals to save the little he had for necessities, or the memories of a life he'd once had, a life that now felt like it belonged to someone else. His stomach growled, but Joe ignored it. He was used to hunger. What he wasn't used to was the weariness that settled in his bones, the ache that came not just from his body, but from his spirit. From the corner of his eye, he saw a small boy run up to the oak tree, tugging at his mother's hand. The mother hesitated when she saw Joe, her face a mixture of caution and pity. She quickly led her child away, her smile tight. Joe closed his eyes and leaned back against the tree. The park was bustling, full of life, but to him, it felt distant, like he was watching it all through a window, unable to step inside. Walter rode his bike slowly, keeping an eye on Joe. He knew the man wasn't a threat. If anything, Joe was one of the quieter souls who frequented the park. But Walter also knew how cruel the world could be to people like him. He thought about approaching Joe, maybe striking up a conversation, but decided against it for now. Joe had his pride, and Walter respected that. "Maybe next time," Walter muttered to himself as he pedaled away. Bethany paused to adjust her scarf. "This city, I swear, it's going downhill every year, don't you think?" Sarah nodded absent-mindedly, her mind still caught on the man beneath the oak tree. "Yes, downhill," she murmured. Bethany raised an eyebrow, but didn't press. Instead, she looped her arm through Sarah's and steered her toward the bustling street beyond the park. As they left, Joe remained under the oak tree, blending into the background of the lively park. To most, he was invisible, a shadow among the sunshine. But to those who cared to look closer, there was a story waiting to be told. The wind rustled softly through the trees as Joe made his way back to the encampment, a hidden enclave near the edge of the park where the city's forgotten found refuge. A cluster of tattered tents and makeshift shelters greeted him, their occupants busy with the quiet monotony of survival. Joe paused near a small fire pit where a woman was boiling water in a battered tin can. Lila Johnson, one of the few people Joe considered a friend, glanced up and gave him a tired smile. Her son, a boy of about 7, sat close to her, doodling on a scrap of cardboard with a dull crayon. "Long day, Joe?" Lila asked, stirring the water absently. Joe dropped his backpack onto the ground and eased himself onto an overturned bucket, groaning as his joints protested. "They all are," he replied. "But yeah, this one felt longer." Lila chuckled softly. "I hear that." Joe's eyes flicked to her son, who was now looking up at him expectantly. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a slightly bruised apple, rolling it toward the boy. The child's face lit up, and he grabbed it with a gleeful, "Thanks, Mr. Joe." "Don't mention it, kid," Joe said with a faint smile. Lila's expression softened as she watched the interaction. "You're too good to us," she said quietly. Joe waved her off. "It's just an apple, Lila." But to her, it was more than that. In a world that had taken so much from them, small gestures like these were treasures. The two fell into a companionable silence for a while, the faint crackle of the fire and the distant hum of city life filling the gaps. Finally, Lila broke the quiet. "You ever think about what it'd be like to go back?" she asked, her voice low, almost hesitant. Joe didn't need to ask what she meant. "To a normal life?" She nodded. He sighed, his gaze distant. "All the time. But it's not that simple, is it? Once you fall this far, climbing back up feels impossible. And some days, you start wondering if it's even worth it." Lila stared into the fire. "Yeah, I get that. But for him," she glanced at her son, "I have to try." Joe didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was softer. "You're stronger than me, Lila. That kid of yours, he's lucky to have you." Lila shook her head. "We're all just doing what we can, Joe. That's all anyone can do." Joe nodded, his thoughts drifting. He remembered his own family, how different his life had been before everything fell apart. His wife, Mary, always laughing, always humming some tune as she worked in the garden. The smell of fresh wood shavings in his workshop, the satisfaction of building something with his hands. And then, the slow unraveling. The loss of his job when the furniture factory shut down. Mary's illness, the endless medical bills, the foreclosure notice that came like a death sentence. Joe clenched his fists, pushing the memories away. What was the point of dwelling on them? That life was gone. All he had now were the here and the now. But sometimes, late at night, when the city quieted and the shadows grew long, he let himself remember. And in those moments, the weight of his loss felt unbearable. As the evening deepened, the encampment settled into its familiar rhythm. A faint melody drifted through the air from a harmonica played by one of the older residents, its mournful tune a reflection of their shared struggles. Joe sat by the fire, his hands outstretched to soak in the warmth, though the chill in his bones felt deeper than the cold air. Lila's son had fallen asleep against her side, clutching the crayon he'd used to draw a lopsided sun on the cardboard. She carefully draped an old blanket over him, then leaned back, her eyes scanning the camp. "Did you ever have kids, Joe?" Lila asked softly, almost hesitant to intrude on his thoughts. Joe's jaw tightened, but he didn't look at her. "No," he said after a pause. "Mary and I wanted to, but life got in the way." Lila didn't press him. She'd learned that Joe rarely spoke about his past unless it was in fragments, carefully chosen and measured. "You would have been a good dad," she said after a moment. Joe gave her a faint smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe, but maybe it's better this way. No one to disappoint." Lila frowned. "That's not fair. You're a good man, Joe. This place doesn't define you." Joe chuckled dryly. "Doesn't it? Look at me, Lila. This is who I am now. I'm just trying to make it to the next day, same as everyone here. Lila opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, a commotion broke out near the edge of the camp. Two men were arguing loudly, their voices carrying over the quiet. One of them, Sam, was known for his short temper and quick fists. Joe rose to his feet, his weary body protesting the movement. "Stay here," he told Lila. He approached the men, his hands raised in a calming gesture. "Hey, what's going on here?" Sam turned, his face twisted in frustration. "He took my spot. I've been here all week, and now he thinks he can just show up and—" Joe stepped between them, his voice firm but calm. "Come on, Sam. It's not worth fighting over. We've all got it rough enough as it is." The other man, younger and visibly nervous, shuffled back, mumbling an apology. Sam muttered under his breath, but didn't press the issue. Joe waited until the tension eased before stepping away, shaking his head. When he returned to the fire, Lila was watching him with a mixture of admiration and sadness. "You always do that," she said. "Do what?" "Step in, try to fix things, even when it's not your problem." Joe shrugged. "Someone's got to keep the peace." "You're more than that, Joe," Lila said. "You've got a heart. Don't let this place take that away from you." Joe didn't respond. He stared into the flames, his thoughts heavy. He'd been in the camp long enough to know how it wore people down, how it stripped away hope, kindness, humanity. But Lila was right. No matter how hard it got, he couldn't let himself lose that last piece of who he used to be. As the fire burned lower and the camp grew quiet, Joe leaned back and closed his eyes. The sounds of the city hummed faintly in the distance, a reminder of the world that continued on without them. For a moment, he let himself imagine what it would be like to belong to that world again, to walk the streets without feeling invisible, to have a place to call home. But as the cold night settled around him, he pushed the thought away. He was still here, still breathing, and for now, that was enough. The forest loomed large and inviting as Lily skipped along the well-worn trail. The dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves danced across her face, and her excitement grew with each step. She held a small wicker basket in one hand, her other hand brushing against the tall grass that lined the path. She had begged her mother to let her go on this outing with her classmates. It was a nature scavenger hunt, and their teacher, Miss Turner, had promised a small prize for whoever collected the most unique items. Lily had her heart set on winning. She'd already found a shiny acorn, a feather, and a cluster of wildflowers, but her eyes were now scanning the underbrush for something truly special. Her group had started to drift ahead, their chatter fading as Lily wandered off the trail. A flash of color caught her eye, a cluster of vibrant mushrooms nestled at the base of a tree. "Perfect," she whispered to herself, darting toward them. As she bent down to pluck one, she noticed another, larger mushroom a few steps further into the woods. She moved deeper, her focus entirely on her discoveries. The forest around her grew denser, the air cooler, but Lily paid no mind. It wasn't until she had a handful of mushrooms that she straightened up and realized she couldn't hear her classmates anymore. She spun around, her heart skipping a beat, as she saw nothing but trees in every direction. "Miss Turner?" she called out. Her voice sounded small, swallowed by the forest. "Ella? James? Anyone?" The rustling of leaves was her only answer. Lily's chest tightened, and she clutched her basket to her chest. She retraced her steps, or at least what she thought were her steps, but the trail was nowhere to be found. Panic set in quickly. Her small legs carried her faster as she stumbled over roots and through underbrush. The towering trees, which had seemed so beautiful and inviting, now felt suffocating. Their branches reached out like dark arms, their shadows stretching long across the forest floor. Lily's breathing grew ragged as she called out again and again, her voice breaking. "Help! I'm lost! Somebody!" The weight of her basket became unbearable, and she dropped it, mushrooms scattering across the dirt. She stumbled forward, tripping over a hidden root, and landed hard on her hands and knees. Tears spilled down her cheeks as the sting of the fall hit her. She sat there for a moment, her small body trembling, unsure of what to do. The sounds of the forest surrounded her, the rustle of leaves, the chirping of birds, and the occasional snap of a twig. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, but the tears kept coming. For a fleeting moment, she thought of her mother. Sarah had kissed her goodbye that morning, reminding her to stay close to the group. "Be careful, sweetheart," she'd said, "and don't wander off." Lily buried her face in her hands, guilt mixing with fear. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, the forest grew darker, shadows stretched longer, and the golden hues of daylight faded into cooler, bluer tones. Lily pushed herself to her feet, her legs wobbly, and began walking again. She had no idea where she was going. She only knew she couldn't stay still. Her foot caught on another root, and she fell again, this time scraping her elbow. She cried out in pain, but the sound seemed swallowed by the vastness around her. Her tears came in earnest now, heavy sobs that racked her small frame. She didn't notice the subtle shift in the forest, how it grew quieter, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. But someone did. In the distance, Joe had been wandering along the forest's edge, seeking a moment of solitude. The park had grown too noisy and the camp too crowded, so he'd chosen the quiet company of the trees instead. At first, he thought the faint cries were a figment of his imagination, but as they grew louder, more desperate, he stopped in his tracks. "Is someone out there?" he muttered to himself. His instincts kicked in, and he began to follow the sound. The uneven terrain didn't slow him. His years of navigating the streets had trained him to be sure-footed, even in the most precarious places. As the cries grew clearer, his pace quickened. He called out, his deep voice steady but urgent. "Hello? Is someone there?" The sobbing stopped for a moment, replaced by a tentative, trembling voice. "Hello?" Joe followed the voice until he spotted her. A small figure curled up beneath a tree, her face streaked with dirt and tears. "Hey there," he said gently, crouching down to her level. "Are you okay?" Lily looked up at him, her wide eyes filled with fear and relief. She didn't answer, just shook her head. Joe softened his tone. "You're lost, aren't you?" She nodded, wiping at her face with trembling hands. "It's okay," Joe said, his voice steady. "You're going to be all right. I'll help you get out of here." Lily hesitated, taking in the sight of him, his weathered face, his worn clothes. But something about his eyes, warm and kind, made her feel safe. Joe extended his hand. "Come on, let's get you back to your people." After a moment, Lily placed her small hand in his, and he helped her to her feet. She wobbled a little, but he steadied her. "You'll be fine," he said. "You've got me now." The soft crunch of leaves underfoot was the only sound as Joe led Lily through the dense forest. The little girl clung tightly to his hand, her small fingers trembling in his larger, calloused ones. Her cheeks were streaked with dirt and tears, and her breaths were still uneven from crying. "Are you hurt?" Joe asked gently, slowing his pace to match hers. Lily shook her head, though she winced when her scraped elbow brushed against her side. Just a little. I fell." Joe knelt, examining her arm. The scrape was shallow but red and raw. He frowned, pulling a crumpled handkerchief from his pocket. "This isn't much, but it'll keep it clean for now." He carefully tied it around her elbow, his movements deliberate and patient. "Thank you," Lily said softly. Joe stood, brushing off his knees. "We'll get you patched up properly once we're out of here. But first, let's find our way back, all right?" Lily nodded, but her wide eyes darted nervously around the trees. "Do you know the way?" Joe hesitated for a moment before answering. "Not exactly," he admitted. "But I know how to follow signs, and I've been in enough places like this to figure it out. Trust me, kid, we'll get you home." His voice was steady, his tone calm, and Lily found herself believing him, even though the forest still felt overwhelming. They began walking again, Joe's sharp eyes scanning the surroundings for markers. A broken branch here, a faint trail there. The forest was unfamiliar to him, but he had learned to navigate by instinct, a skill honed by years of living on the streets. As they walked, Joe kept the silence from stretching too long. He'd seen fear like Lily's before, and he knew distraction was key. "What's your name, kid?" "Lily," she said, her voice still small. "Lily Ellington." "Nice name," Joe said with a small smile. "I'm Joe, just Joe." "Thank you for helping me, Mr. Joe," Lily said, glancing up at him. Joe chuckled softly. "You don't have to call me Mr. Just Joe is fine." Lily gave a faint smile for the first time, her grip on his hand loosening just a bit. "All right, Lily," Joe continued, his voice light. "Let's play a little game. Every time you see something interesting, you tell me about it. Maybe it'll help us figure out which way to go." Lily looked unsure at first, but as they walked, she started to point things out. A moss-covered rock, a butterfly flitting through the trees, the way the sunlight filtered through the leaves. Her voice grew steadier with each observation, and Joe nodded along, encouraging her. "That's good," he said, when she pointed out a tree that looked like it had a face carved into its bark. "See? You've got sharp eyes. We'll be out of here in no time." The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting the forest in golden hues. Joe's pace quickened slightly. He knew they needed to find a clearer path before it got dark. He kept his worries to himself, though, glancing down at Lily every so often to make sure she was keeping up. At one point, Lily stumbled over a root, and Joe caught her before she fell. "Careful there," he said, steadying her. "Sorry," she mumbled. "Nothing to be sorry about," Joe said firmly. "You're doing great, kid. We're a team now, right?" Lily nodded, a hint of pride flashing in her eyes. As they approached a small clearing, Joe paused. He knelt again, this time to inspect the ground. The dirt was packed down, and faint footprints led away from the clearing. They weren't Lily's, too large for a child, but they were fresh. "Someone's been through here recently," Joe murmured, half to himself. He stood and looked around, spotting what appeared to be a faint trail leading away. Lily noticed his expression. "Is that a good thing?" Joe turned to her with a reassuring smile. "It is. It means we're on the right track. Let's keep moving." Lily took his hand again, and they stepped into the clearing. For the first time since she'd realized she was lost, she felt a glimmer of hope. The clearing led them to a faint trail, barely visible beneath the layers of fallen leaves and scattered branches. Joe moved cautiously, scanning the ground for any signs of direction, while keeping a steady hand on Lily's shoulder. The forest was growing quieter as the day waned. The occasional bird call seemed distant, and the rustling of leaves under their feet was the only sound breaking the stillness. Joe," Lily began, her voice hesitant. "Do you think my mom is looking for me?" Joe nodded without hesitation. "I'm sure she is, kid. Moms always look for their kids." Lily frowned, clutching his hand a little tighter. "I hope she's not mad at me. She told me to stay close, but I just wanted to find something special for the scavenger hunt." Joe stopped and knelt down so he could look her in the eye. "Hey, listen. Your mom might be worried, but she won't be mad. She'll just be glad you're safe. That's what parents care about most." Lily's eyes glistened with tears, but she nodded. "You think so?" "I know so," Joe said firmly. He stood, his knees creaking as he did, and adjusted the strap of his worn backpack. "Now, let's get you back to her, huh?" The trail took them deeper into the woods, but Joe remained calm, his sharp eyes scanning for anything that might indicate they were heading the right way. He spotted a broken branch here, a patch of disturbed dirt there. Each small clue felt like a breadcrumb, leading them closer to safety. Lily, emboldened by Joe's calm demeanor, began talking again. "Do you go on adventures like this a lot?" Joe chuckled. "Not exactly. I've been through a lot of places, though. Learned how to find my way around when things don't go as planned." "Like what?" Lily asked, curious now. Joe hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Well, sometimes you end up in places you don't expect, and you've got to figure out how to make it work. That's what life is, really. A whole lot of figuring it out as you go." Lily tilted her head, her youthful innocence making her bold. "Is that why you were in the park, figuring it out?" Joe smiled faintly, his steps slowing. "Something like that." As they rounded a bend, the faint sound of running water reached their ears. Joe's face lit up with recognition. "A stream," he said, his tone lifting. "That's a good sign." They followed the sound until they reached a small creek cutting through the forest. The water was clear, and the stream's gentle babble filled the air. Joe crouched by the bank, splashing some water on his face, and then cupping his hands to take a drink. "You thirsty?" he asked Lily. She nodded, and he showed her how to scoop the water without letting her hands touch the surface. "It's not like the water from a faucet," he said, "but it's clean enough." Lily drank cautiously, then wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "It tastes funny," Joe chuckled. "That's how you know it's from nature." After they rested for a moment, Joe glanced at the stream's flow. "Water usually leads somewhere," he mused aloud. "Let's follow it." The stream eventually led them to a wider, more defined trail, one that was clearly used by hikers. Joe's shoulders relaxed as relief washed over him. "This is it," he said, a small smile breaking across his face. "We're getting close now." Lily looked up at him, her eyes shining with hope. "Really?" "Really," Joe confirmed. "You've been brave, kid. We're almost there." They followed the trail, and soon enough, faint voices reached their ears. Lily's pace quickened, her excitement bubbling over. "Do you hear that? It's people!" she exclaimed. Joe grinned, though he stayed a step behind her, letting her take the lead. As the voices grew louder, the trees thinned, and they emerged onto a larger path, where a small group of searchers was gathered. A woman, with Sarah's unmistakable blonde hair, turned at the sound of Lily's voice. "Mom!" Lily cried, running toward her. "Lily!" Sarah dropped to her knees, arms open wide. She scooped her daughter into a tight embrace, tears streaming down her face. Joe stood back, watching the reunion with a quiet satisfaction. He adjusted his backpack, ready to slip away unnoticed, but one of the searchers, a tall man with a flashlight, spotted him. "Hey, who's that?" the man asked. Sarah turned, still clutching Lily. Her eyes landed on Joe, and for a moment they widened in recognition. Joe tipped his head, a faint smile on his face. "She's safe now," he said simply. Before Sarah could respond, Joe stepped back into the trees, disappearing down the trail. The sun dipped lower in the sky as Joe and Lily continued along the narrow trail. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly around them, its towering trees casting long shadows that darkened with every passing moment. Joe's sharp eyes scanned the ground, the branches above, and the distant bends in the path, searching for signs that would lead them to safety. "Are we close, Joe?" Lily's voice was soft but tinged with worry. Joe glanced down at her and forced a reassuring smile. "We're getting there, kid. One step at a time." Lily nodded, though her grip on his hand tightened. The air grew cooler, and the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze was the only sound accompanying their footsteps. Joe kept his pace steady, mindful of Lily's smaller strides. His body ached, the years of hardship weighing heavily on his joints, but he didn't let it show. This wasn't about him. It was about getting the little girl home. Their first real challenge came when the trail abruptly ended at a wide creek. The stream they had followed earlier had grown into a larger body of water, its current swift and relentless. Smooth, moss-covered rocks jutted out from the surface, forming a precarious path across. Lily hesitated at the edge, her eyes wide. "Do we have to cross it?" Joe crouched down beside her, his voice calm. "It's not as bad as it looks. I'll go first, and then I'll help you, okay?" Lily's lower lip trembled, but she nodded. Joe tested the first rock with his foot, then stepped onto it carefully. It wobbled slightly but held his weight. He moved to the next one, then another, his movements deliberate and steady. "All right, your turn," he called back to Lily. "Just step where I stepped and take it slow. I'm right here." Lily's small hands gripped the edge of the bank as she placed one foot onto the first rock. It was slippery, and she wobbled, letting out a small yelp. Joe immediately reached out, his voice firm but gentle. "I've got you, Lily, just one step at a time." She nodded, swallowing her fear, and slowly made her way across. Joe held her hand for the final few steps, steadying her until she was safely on the other side. "You did great," he said, giving her a small smile. Lily beamed, her earlier fear replaced with a flicker of pride. "I couldn't have done it without you." Joe chuckled. "That's what teams are for, kid." As they pressed on, the forest became denser, the fading light barely piercing through the thick canopy above. Joe kept his focus sharp, every sense tuned to the environment around them. Lily, however, began to grow weary. Her steps slowed, and she rubbed her eyes with a tired hand. "Joe," she murmured, "I'm so tired. My legs hurt." Joe stopped and crouched down to her level. "I know, Lily. It's been a long day, but we've got to keep moving for a little while longer, okay? We can't stay here. Too many bugs and not enough blankets." Lily pouted but nodded. "Okay." Joe thought for a moment, then crouched lower. "Climb on. I'll carry you for a bit." Lily hesitated. "Are you sure? I'm heavy." Joe laughed softly. "You're not as heavy as you think. Come on." She climbed onto his back, and he adjusted her weight, holding her legs securely. "All right," he said. "Now, let's keep going." As they walked, Joe started to hum quietly. The sound was low and soothing, a melody from long ago that brought him some comfort. "What's that song?" Lily asked, resting her chin on his shoulder. It's just something my wife used to hum, Joe said, his voice tinged with a faint sadness. Your wife? Lily asked curiously. Joe nodded. Yeah, Mary, she loved music. She used to hum this tune while she worked in the garden. Where is she now? Lily asked innocently. Joe's throat tightened, but he kept his voice steady. She passed away a long time ago. I'm sorry, Lily whispered. Joe smiled faintly. Thanks, kid, but she'd like to know that I'm still humming her song. She always said music makes the tough times easier. Lily thought about that for a moment, then softly began to hum along with him. The sound was shaky at first, but it grew steadier, filling the dark forest with a quiet sense of hope. After what felt like hours, they stumbled upon a clearing. Joe stopped, setting Lily down gently. Let's take a break here, he said, lowering himself onto a fallen log. His muscles ached, but he ignored the pain, focusing instead on Lily. She sat beside him, her small body leaning against his arm. Joe, do you think we'll find my mom soon? Joe looked down at her, his face softening. I know we will. Your mom's probably out there looking for you right now, and we're closer than you think. Lily nodded, her trust in him unwavering. Joe reached into his backpack and pulled out a slightly crumpled granola bar. Here, he said, handing it to her. You need to keep your energy up. Lily took it gratefully, nibbling at the edges. Aren't you going to eat? She asked. Joe shook his head. I'm fine. You need it more than I do. Lily frowned but didn't argue. She finished the bar quickly, her energy returning just enough to keep her moving. They continued on, following the faint signs Joe had picked out. The broken branches, the slight indentations in the ground. He was tired, his body protesting with every step, but he refused to let it show. Lily needed him to be strong, and that was all that mattered. Eventually, the sound of voices reached their ears. Lily perked up, her face lighting with hope. Do you hear that? She asked excitedly. Joe nodded, a small smile breaking across his face. Yeah, kid, I hear it. They quickened their pace, and soon the forest thinned, revealing a group of people with flashlights and worried expressions. Lily, a familiar voice called out. Mom, Lily cried, breaking into a run. Joe watched as Sarah scooped her daughter into her arms, tears streaming down her face. He stayed back, his heart swelling with relief and something else, something bittersweet. As the search party began to gather around Sarah and Lily, Joe quietly stepped away, blending into the shadows of the forest. The night sky had deepened into a canvas of stars. By the time Sarah arrived at the search headquarters, a makeshift station set up near the edge of the forest, her heart pounded as she stepped out of the car, her heels clicking against the gravel. She barely registered the sounds of radios crackling and searchers calling out in the distance. All she could think about was Lily, her precious Lily, somewhere out there, lost and alone. A uniformed officer approached her, his face calm but serious. Mrs. Ellington? Yes, she said breathlessly. I'm Lily's mother. Have you found her? We received a report just now, the officer replied. A man brought her to one of our teams. She's safe, ma'am. The relief hit Sarah like a wave, so powerful that her knees nearly gave out. Where is she? I need to see her. This way, the officer said, gesturing for her to follow. When Sarah saw Lily, she ran, her heels sinking into the soft dirt as she closed the distance. Her daughter's golden hair was disheveled, her clothes smudged with dirt, but she was there, alive, unharmed. Mom, Lily cried, breaking free from the officer who was guiding her. Sarah dropped to her knees, catching Lily in her arms and holding her as tightly as she could. Tears streamed down her face as she kissed the top of her daughter's head, over and over. Oh, sweetheart, Sarah sobbed. I'm so sorry. I should have never let you out of my sight. I'm okay, Mom, Lily said, her voice muffled against Sarah's shoulder. Joe helped me. He brought me back. Sarah pulled back just enough to look into Lily's face. Joe? Who's Joe? He's the man who found me, Lily said, her eyes wide. He was in the forest. He helped me cross the creek, carried me when I got tired, and made sure I got here. Sarah's heart twisted at the thought of a stranger protecting her child when she couldn't. She turned to the officer standing nearby. Where is this man? I need to thank him. The officer shook his head. He left shortly after delivering your daughter to the search team. He didn't stay long, didn't even want recognition, just said she was safe now and walked away. Sarah stared at him, her mind reeling. But Who is he? Did he give you his name? He signed a brief report, the officer said, holding up a clipboard. Joe. No last name, just Joe. We didn't get much else from him. Back in the car with Lily asleep in the back seat, Sarah couldn't stop the flood of emotions overwhelming her. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white. Her mind replayed the events of the day, the panic she felt when she realized Lily was missing, the hours spent helplessly waiting for news, and now the knowledge that a complete stranger had risked his own safety to bring her daughter back. How had she let this happen? She had always prided herself on being a good mother, attentive and protective. But today, she had failed in the most basic way. The thought of Lily wandering alone in the woods made her stomach turn. Anything could have happened, and yet, this man, this Joe, had stepped in when she couldn't. Thank you, Sarah whispered to the empty car. Her voice cracked, and she blinked rapidly to clear the tears that blurred her vision. Whoever you are, thank you. At home, after tucking Lily into bed, Sarah sat in the quiet of the living room. The house, usually a place of comfort, felt strangely heavy tonight. The ticking of the clock on the wall was the only sound as she stared at the blank page of a notebook on the coffee table. She picked up a pen and began to write. To Joe, I don't know who you are or where you came from, but you saved my daughter's life today. I don't have the words to express how much that means to me. You were there when I wasn't, and I will never forget what you did. I hope, wherever you are, you know that you made a difference, not just for Lily, but for me too. You reminded me of the goodness that still exists in this world, even in the most unexpected places. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. Sincerely, Sarah Ellington. Sarah stared at the letter for a long time before folding it and slipping it into an envelope. She didn't know what to do with it, or if she would ever have the chance to give it to him, but writing it made her feel just a little closer to the stranger who had become her hero. As she climbed the stairs to bed, she paused outside Lily's room. The soft sound of her daughter's breathing brought her a sense of peace, but it also reignited a determination in her heart. She didn't know who Joe was, but she would find a way to thank him properly. He deserved that much. The afternoon sun was warm and golden as it filtered through the trees of Central Park. The park was alive with activity, children laughing as they chased one another across the grass, couples strolling hand in hand, and joggers weaving through the winding paths. Sarah walked beside Lily, her hand resting lightly on her daughter's shoulder. It had been a week since the forest incident, and Sarah had insisted on this outing. She wanted to get Lily out in the fresh air to help her regain a sense of normalcy after the ordeal. But, deep down, Sarah also hoped it would ease her own lingering guilt. Lily skipped ahead a few steps, her blonde hair bouncing in the sunlight. She was still the same vibrant little girl, but Sarah noticed the small changes, how Lily occasionally glanced over her shoulder, how she seemed to hesitate before venturing too far. "Mom, can I get some ice cream?" Lily called, pointing to a vendor cart nearby. Sarah smiled, pulling her wallet from her purse. "Of course. Go ahead, sweetie." As Lily ran toward the cart, Sarah took a moment to breathe in the crisp air. She let her eyes wander across the park, her mind drifting to the man who had brought Lily back to her. She had thought of him often over the past week, replaying Lily's descriptions and wondering who he was, where he had come from. Joe, she murmured to herself. It was such a simple name, but it carried so much weight now. When Lily returned with her cone, they continued their walk. The sound of her chatter filled the air as she described the scavenger hunt again, how she had gotten lost, and how Joe had found her. "He was so nice, Mom," Lily said, licking her cone. "He carried me when I got tired, and he told me a story about his wife and how she used to hum songs in the garden." Sarah listened, her chest tightening with every word. This man had been a stranger, yet he had shown her daughter kindness and care when she needed it most. Lily suddenly stopped, her eyes widening. "Mom, it's him!" Sarah followed her daughter's gaze and froze. Sitting on a bench near a grove of trees was a man she recognized immediately from Lily's description. His clothes were worn but clean, his posture slightly hunched as he looked out across the park. Joe. Lily didn't hesitate. She ran to him, her ice cream cone forgotten as it fell to the ground. "Joe!" Joe looked up, startled, but his face softened into a smile as Lily threw her arms around him. "Hey there, kid," he said warmly, patting her back. "Good to see you again." Sarah stood a few feet away, her heart pounding. She wanted to approach, but her feet felt rooted to the ground. She watched as Joe and Lily spoke, the sight of her daughter's joy mixed with her own nervousness. Finally, she took a step forward, her voice quiet but steady. "You're Joe." Joe glanced up at her, his expression unreadable. I'm Sarah Ellington," she said, her voice faltering slightly. "Lily's mother." Joe nodded. "I figured as much. Nice to meet you, Mrs. Ellington." She hesitated, searching for the right words. "I don't even know how to thank you. You saved my daughter's life." Joe shifted uncomfortably, his gaze dropping to the ground. "You don't need to thank me. I just did what anyone would have done." "But not everyone would have done what you did," Sarah insisted. Her voice was firm now, the weight of her emotions pushing through. "You didn't just find her. You stayed with her, protected her, brought her back to me. That means more to me than I can ever say." Joe looked up then, his eyes meeting hers. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Lily broke the silence, tugging on Joe's sleeve. "Joe, do you come to the park a lot?" "Every now and then," Joe said with a faint smile. "It's a nice place to sit and think." Lily turned to Sarah. "Mom, can Joe come have dinner with us, please?" Sarah blinked, caught off guard by the request. "Oh, well, Joe shook his head gently. "That's kind of you, Lily, but I wouldn't want to intrude." "You wouldn't be intruding," Sarah said quickly. The words came out before she could second-guess them. "Please, it's the least we can do after everything you've done." Joe hesitated, his brow furrowing. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm not sure that's a good idea." "Why not?" Lily asked, her voice innocent but persistent. Joe glanced at Sarah, his expression guarded. "I just think it's better this way." Sarah stepped closer, her voice soft but resolute. "Joe, I don't know your story, and I'm not going to pretend I do. But you helped my daughter, and I want to help you, even if it's just a meal. Please let me do this." Joe studied her for a long moment. Finally, he nodded. "All right," he said quietly. "But just dinner?" Lily cheered, and Sarah felt a strange mix of relief and nervousness. This man, who had seemed so unreachable, was now stepping into their lives in a way she hadn't expected. As they walked toward the park's exit, Sarah found herself glancing at Joe. There was something about him, a quiet strength, a sadness that lingered just beneath the surface. She realized she wanted to know more, not just out of gratitude but out of genuine curiosity. Lily skipped ahead, humming a tune that Joe had taught her in the forest. Sarah fell into step beside him, her voice hesitant but warm. "Do you have family, Joe?" He glanced at her, his face unreadable for a moment before he shook his head. "Not anymore." "I'm sorry," Sarah said softly. Joe nodded, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. "It's all right. Life has a way of taking things from you. You learn to live with it." They walked in silence for a while, the weight of his words settling between them. "Thank you," Sarah said again, her voice breaking the quiet. "Not just for saving Lily, but for being there when she needed someone. I don't know what I would have done if—" She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Joe's voice was low but steady. "You don't have to thank me, Mrs. Ellington. I'm just glad she's okay." As they reached the edge of the park, Sarah knew this was only the beginning. Meeting Joe had already begun to shift something inside her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that their paths had crossed for a reason. The sound of silverware clinking softly against plates filled Sarah's dining room. The warm, golden light of the chandelier above cast a cozy glow over the room, but an undercurrent of tension lingered. Sarah sat across from Joe, her hands neatly folded on the table, while Lily chatted animatedly between bites of macaroni and cheese. Joe was polite, eating quietly and nodding occasionally at Lily's stories, but Sarah noticed how his eyes avoided hers. There was a heaviness about him, a guardedness that made him seem both present and distant at the same time. "Lily, sweetheart," Sarah said gently, interrupting her daughter's tale about school, "why don't you grab some of those cookies we baked earlier? I think Joe might like one." Lily perked up. "Oh, they're chocolate chip. You'll love them, Joe." She hopped down from her chair and darted toward the kitchen, leaving the adults alone. Sarah cleared her throat, her fingers brushing a stray crumb from the table. "I hope the food is okay," she began. Joe looked up, his expression softening slightly. "It's great. Thank you for this. For everything." "You don't need to thank me," Sarah replied quickly. "Not after what you did for Lily. Joe shifted uncomfortably, glancing down at his plate. I didn't do anything special. Just made sure she was safe. Sarah leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but insistent. Joe, you saved her life. That's not something I can ever repay. Joe hesitated, then gave a small nod, though his expression remained distant. When Lily returned with the cookies, she placed a plateful in front of Joe and grinned. Try one. I made them all by myself. Well, Mom helped a little. Joe chuckled, picking up a cookie and taking a bite. These are good, he said, smiling for the first time that evening. See, Mom, I told you they were good, Lily said proudly. Sarah smiled at her daughter, then turned back to Joe. Lily, why don't you go pick out a book to read before bed? I'll come tuck you in soon. Lily pouted slightly but obeyed, leaving Sarah and Joe alone again. The silence stretched for a moment before Sarah spoke. Joe, can I ask you something? He looked up, his expression guarded but curious. Sure. You mentioned in the forest that your wife used to hum songs. Lily told me about it, Sarah began carefully. Do you mind sharing more about her? Joe's posture stiffened slightly, and he glanced down at his hands, which rested loosely on the table. For a moment, Sarah thought he might brush off the question, but then he sighed. Mary, he said quietly. She was everything. Sarah waited, giving him space to continue. She loved to hum, Joe said, his voice softening as a faint smile tugged at his lips. She'd hum when she cooked, when she worked in the garden, even when she folded laundry. It wasn't loud or anything, just this little melody that followed her everywhere she went. Sarah smiled faintly. She sounds like she was wonderful. She was, Joe said, his eyes distant. She had this way of making everything feel lighter, even when things got hard. And things got hard, a lot. What happened? Sarah asked gently. Joe exhaled slowly, the faint smile fading. She got sick. Cancer. We didn't have much, but we spent everything we had trying to get her better. Hospital bills, treatments, you name it. Sarah's heart ached at the raw pain in his voice. She fought so hard, Joe continued, his gaze fixed on some invisible point in the distance. But it wasn't enough. After she passed, everything just fell apart. I couldn't keep up with the bills, lost the house, lost everything. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. I'm so sorry, Sarah said softly. I can't imagine how hard that must have been. Joe shrugged, though his shoulders sagged with the weight of the memories. Life doesn't always go the way you want it to. You just keep moving forward, or at least try to. The weight of Joe's story hung heavy in the room. Sarah clasped her hands together, unsure of how to respond. Every word he had spoken carried a quiet, unrelenting pain, a life marked by loss and struggle, yet somehow filled with resilience. I don't think I could have endured what you've been through, Sarah said finally, her voice soft but steady. Losing someone you love like that, and then everything else on top of it. Joe looked at her, his expression unreadable. You'd be surprised what you can handle when you don't have a choice. Sarah nodded slowly. But still, to lose Mary and keep going, to survive like you have, that takes strength, more strength than most people have. Joe gave a faint chuckle, but there was no humor in it. I don't know about strength. Most days it's just getting from one minute to the next. You get used to it after a while. You stop thinking about what you've lost and just focus on what's left. Sarah hesitated before asking, And what's left for you, Joe? He paused, his gaze dropping to the table. Not much, he admitted quietly. But sometimes, like when I met Lily, you get these moments, little reminders that maybe you're still here for a reason. Sarah felt her throat tighten. She reached out instinctively, placing her hand lightly over his. Joe, you're not just surviving. You made a difference. You saved my daughter's life. That's not something small. That's everything. Joe glanced at her hand on his expression softening. I guess that's something. The sound of Lily's footsteps on the stairs broke the moment. She bounded into the room, clutching a picture book in her hands. Mom, can we read this one tonight? She asked, holding it up. Sarah smiled and nodded. Of course, sweetheart. Why don't you go get ready for bed, and I'll be up in a minute. Lily ran off again, leaving Sarah and Joe alone once more. She's a good kid, Joe said, a small smile playing at his lips. She is, Sarah agreed. She's been talking about you nonstop since the forest. You've made quite the impression. Joe's smile faltered slightly and he shook his head. I'm just glad she's okay. Sarah leaned forward, her gaze intent. Joe, I know you don't want recognition or gratitude, but I need you to understand how much what you did means to me. Lily is my world. I don't know what I would have done if I'd lost her. Joe shifted uncomfortably, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Acceptance, maybe, or a glimmer of relief. As the conversation drifted back to Joe's past, Sarah felt a growing sense of admiration for him. She couldn't imagine losing everything he had lost and still finding the will to help others. Yet here he was, sitting in her home, a living testament to quiet strength and selflessness. Do you ever think about starting over? Sarah asked cautiously. Joe shrugged. I think about it sometimes, but it's not that simple. Once you fall far enough, people stop seeing you as someone who can get back up. And after a while, you stop believing it yourself. That's not true, Sarah said firmly. Joe, you're one of the strongest people I've ever met. I think you can do anything if you want to. Joe looked at her, his expression unreadable. Maybe. But it's hard to believe that when the world spent years telling you otherwise. Sarah's heart ached at his words. She couldn't change the past for him, but she felt a deep need to help him find something better, something he deserved. I don't know what I can do to help, she said softly, but I want to. I want to try. Joe hesitated, then nodded. I appreciate that, Sarah. I really do. Later that night, after Joe had gone, Sarah sat alone in the living room. The house was quiet, and the warmth of the evening had faded into a cool stillness. Her mind raced with thoughts of Joe, his quiet dignity, his resilience, and the pain he carried so silently. She couldn't stop thinking about what he had said, about how the world had turned its back on him. But she had also seen something else in him, a spark, however faint, of hope. As she looked out the window into the night, she made a silent promise to herself. She didn't know how, but she would find a way to help Joe, not just as a thank you for saving Lily, but because it was the right thing to do. The morning light spilled through the windows of Sarah's kitchen as she sat with a cup of coffee, staring thoughtfully at her phone. The memory of her conversation with Joe the night before lingered in her mind. His words about feeling stuck, about the world seeing him as someone who couldn't get back up, echoed in her ears. She knew what she had to do. With a deep breath, Sarah picked up her phone and dialed. Bethany, it's me, she said when her friend answered. Sarah, it's been a few days. Bethany's cheerful tone came through. How's Lily? She's fine, Sarah replied. She's been doing great, actually. Listen, I need to talk to you about something. Can you meet me at the cafe later? Bethany hesitated. Sure, is everything okay? Yes, everything's fine. I need your advice. Later that afternoon, Sarah sat across from Bethany at their usual cafe. The warm hum of conversation around them made the atmosphere feel familiar and safe, but Sarah's nerves were palpable. Bethany sipped her latte, her perfectly manicured nails tapping lightly against the cup. All right, Sarah, what's going on? You're looking unusually serious. Sarah hesitated, then dove in. It's about Joe, the man who saved Lily. Bethany raised an eyebrow. The homeless man? Yes, Sarah said firmly. Him. Bethany leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. All right, I'm listening. Sarah recounted her conversations with Joe, his kindness toward Lily, and the hardships he had endured. She spoke about his resilience, his quiet dignity, and the overwhelming sense that he deserved better than what life had handed him. I want to help him, Sarah said finally. I want to give him a job, a chance to get back on his feet. Bethany's brows furrowed. Sarah, I get that you're grateful, but are you sure this is a good idea? I mean, you don't really know him. I know enough, Sarah replied, her voice steady. I know he's a good man who's been dealt a bad hand. And I know that if we don't give people like Joe a chance, they'll never have one. Bethany was silent for a moment, her gaze flicking to the window as she considered Sarah's words. Over the next few days, Sarah began making arrangements. She spoke with her landscaper, who often needed extra help, and arranged for Joe to join his team. When she called Joe to offer him the opportunity, his initial response was one of surprise and hesitation. Sarah, I don't know, he said, his voice uncertain. I've been out of work for a long time. I'm not sure if I'm the right fit. You're more than the right fit, Joe, Sarah said, her voice firm but kind. You're hardworking, reliable, and you've got more strength than most people I know. Please, let me do this for you." Joe was quiet for a long moment before he finally said, "All right, I'll give it a try." Joe's first day on the job was filled with a mix of nervousness and determination. He arrived early, his clothes clean but still showing signs of wear, and met with the landscaper, a gruff but kind man named Tom. Tom gave him a quick rundown of the tasks, and Joe quickly proved himself to be capable and dedicated. By the end of the day, Tom was impressed. "You've got a good work ethic," Tom said, clapping Joe on the back. "I could use more guys like you." Joe smiled faintly, a flicker of pride in his eyes. Meanwhile, Bethany began to notice the changes in Sarah. She saw how Sarah spoke about Joe with respect and admiration, how she refused to let the stigma of homelessness cloud her judgment. At first, Bethany felt skeptical, her ingrained biases making her question whether Joe deserved the effort Sarah was putting in. But as she watched Sarah's unwavering commitment, something began to shift in her. One day, over lunch, Bethany broached the subject. "You really believe he can turn things around, don't you?" "I do," Sarah said without hesitation. "But it's not just about him. It's about me, too. I want to be the kind of person who sees the good in others, who gives them a chance to succeed." Bethany stirred her iced tea thoughtfully. "You know, I used to think people like Joe were just beyond help. But maybe I was wrong. Maybe we've all been wrong." As weeks passed, Joe began to settle into his new role. He showed up every day, worked hard, and slowly began to regain a sense of purpose. Sarah continued to check in on him, offering support and encouragement whenever he needed it. She even helped him secure a small apartment, modest but clean, giving him a place to finally call his own. One evening, as Sarah and Bethany walked through the park together, they spotted Joe tending to a flower bed near the main path. Bethany paused, watching him for a moment before turning to Sarah. "You were right," Bethany said quietly. "He's not what I expected." Sarah smiled. "He's more than what any of us expected." The morning light spilled through the windows of Sarah's kitchen as she sat with a cup of coffee, staring thoughtfully at her phone. The memory of her conversation with Joe the night before lingered in her mind, his words about feeling stuck, about the world seeing him as someone who couldn't get back up, echoed in her ears. She knew what she had to do. With a deep breath, Sarah picked up her phone and dialed. "Bethany, it's me," she said when her friend answered. "Sarah, it's been a few days." Bethany's cheerful tone came through. "How's Lily?" "She's fine," Sarah replied. "She's been doing great, actually. Listen, I need to talk to you about something. Can you meet me at the cafe later?" Bethany hesitated. "Sure, is everything okay?" "Yes, everything's fine. I need your advice." Later that afternoon, Sarah sat across from Bethany at their usual cafe. The warm hum of conversation around them made the atmosphere feel familiar and safe, but Sarah's nerves were palpable. Bethany sipped her latte, her perfectly manicured nails tapping lightly against the cup. "All right, Sarah, what's going on? You're looking unusually serious." Sarah hesitated, then dove in. "It's about Joe, the man who saved Lily." Bethany raised an eyebrow. "The homeless man?" "Yes," Sarah said firmly. "Him." Bethany leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. "All right, I'm listening." Sarah recounted her conversations with Joe, his kindness toward Lily, and the hardships he had endured. She spoke about his resilience, his quiet dignity, and the overwhelming sense that he deserved better than what life had handed him. "I want to help him," Sarah said finally. "I want to give him a job, a chance to get back on his feet." Bethany's brows furrowed. "Sarah, I get that you're grateful, but are you sure this is a good idea? I mean, you don't really know him." "I know enough," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "I know he's a good man who's been dealt a bad hand, and I know that if we don't give people like Joe a chance, they'll never have one." Bethany was silent for a moment, her gaze flicking to the window as she considered Sarah's words. Over the next few days, Sarah began making arrangements. She spoke with her landscaper, who often needed extra help, and arranged for Joe to join his team. When she called Joe to offer him the opportunity, his initial response was one of surprise and hesitation. "Sarah, I don't know," he said, his voice uncertain. "I've been out of work for a long time. I'm not sure if I'm the right fit." "You're more than the right fit, Joe," Sarah said, her voice firm but kind. "You're hardworking, reliable, and you've got more strength than most people I know. Please, let me do this for you." Joe was quiet for a long moment before he finally said, "All right, I'll give it a try." Joe's first day on the job was filled with a mix of nervousness and determination. He arrived early, his clothes clean but still showing signs of wear, and met with the landscaper, a gruff but kind man named Tom. Tom gave him a quick rundown of the tasks, and Joe quickly proved himself to be capable and dedicated. By the end of the day, Tom was impressed. "You've got a good work ethic," Tom said, clapping Joe on the back. "I could use more guys like you." Joe smiled faintly, a flicker of pride in his eyes. Meanwhile, Bethany began to notice the changes in Sarah. She saw how Sarah spoke about Joe with respect and admiration, how she refused to let the stigma of homelessness cloud her judgment. At first, Bethany felt skeptical, her ingrained biases making her question whether Joe deserved the effort Sarah was putting in. But as she watched Sarah's unwavering commitment, something began to shift in her. One day, over lunch, Bethany broached the subject. "You really believe he can turn things around, don't you?" "I do," Sarah said without hesitation. "But it's not just about him. It's about me, too. I want to be the kind of person who sees the good in others, who gives them a chance to succeed." Bethany stirred her iced tea thoughtfully. "You know, I used to think people like Joe were just beyond help. But maybe I was wrong. Maybe we've all been wrong." As weeks passed, Joe began to settle into his new role. He showed up every day, worked hard, and slowly began to regain a sense of purpose. Sarah continued to check in on him, offering support and encouragement whenever he needed it. She even helped him secure a small apartment, modest but clean, giving him a place to finally call his own. One evening, as Sarah and Bethany walked through the park together, they spotted Joe tending to a flower bed near the main path. Bethany paused, watching him for a moment before turning to Sarah. "You were right," Bethany said quietly. "He's not what I expected." Sarah smiled. "He's more than what any of us expected." The morning sunlight streamed through the windows of the community center, casting a warm glow over the bustling activity within. Joe stood by the front desk, his shirt neatly pressed, a name tag clipped to his chest that read, "Joe, Volunteer Coordinator." A young woman approached him, holding the hand of a boy who couldn't have been more than 5. She looked nervous, her eyes darting around the room. "Hi," Joe said gently, his deep voice calm and welcoming. "How can I help you?" The woman hesitated before replying. "I heard this is a place that helps people like us." Joe smiled, a kindness in his eyes that immediately put her at ease. "You heard right. Come on, let me show you around." Joe led her through the center, pointing out the various resources they offered: a food pantry stocked with donations, a clothing closet filled with gently used items, and a playroom where kids laughed and played while their parents sought assistance. "This place is here for you," Joe said as they stopped by the resource board. "No judgment, no strings, just support when you need it." The woman's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, squeezing her son's hand. "Thank you," she whispered. Joe watched as a staff member approached to guide her through the process. He felt a deep sense of fulfillment that he hadn't experienced in years. Months had passed since Sarah had offered him a chance to rebuild his life, and Joe had embraced it fully. After proving himself at the landscaping job, Sarah had introduced him to a friend who managed the community center. Recognizing Joe's empathy and work ethic, they had offered him a position coordinating volunteers and assisting clients. Joe had been hesitant at first, unsure if he could take on such a role, but Sarah's encouragement had been unwavering. "You have a gift, Joe," she had told him. "You make people feel seen and valued. This is where you belong." Now, every day felt like a new opportunity to make a difference. Joe had become a mentor to many of the center's clients, sharing his story and reminding them that even in the darkest times, there was hope. One afternoon, as Joe organized a donation drive, Sarah and Lily walked into the center. Lily ran to him, her laughter filling the air as she hugged him tightly. "Joe!" she exclaimed. "Guess what? I got an A on my science project." Joe chuckled, kneeling to meet her eyes. "That's amazing, kiddo. I knew you could do it." Sarah approached with a warm smile. "You're becoming quite the role model," she said. Joe stood, his expression a mix of humility and gratitude. "I'm just doing my part." Sarah placed a hand on his arm. "You're doing more than that, Joe. You're changing lives." The community center had become a beacon of hope, not just for those who sought help, but for the volunteers and staff who worked there. Sarah and Bethany had both become regular contributors, organizing fundraisers and events to support the center's mission.